On a chilly December day in 1926, a small group of people gathered at Crowndale Farm on the outskirts of Tavistock to watch the unveiling of a plaque commemorating the birth of the town's most illustrious son. The plaque, a tablet set in the wall of the present farmhouse, bears the simple inscription, "Near here stood the house where Sir Francis Drake, the first Englishman to sail around the world, was born 1542. The plaque only records one of Drake's achievements, but he was a man whose many exploits ensured that his fame would span the centuries to make him one of England's greatest heroes. He rose from humble beginnings to become a legend in his own lifetime, and was a self-made man whose exploits and daring epitomized the spirit of that first turbulent Elizabethan age. Drake, whose father had lived in a small cottage on the edge of this small Devon market town, became a welcome figure at the court of the imperious Elizabeth I. The Queen herself thought highly of Drake, who was a man of courage, resourcefulness, energy, and vision. Elizabeth actually went aboard Drake's ship to knight him after his incredible round-the-world voyage, and he gained a fortune large enough to enable him to buy a substantial estate at Buckland, Monacorum, close by his Tavistock cousins. It was fitting, then, that this century a group of prominent Tavistock people should arrange to affix a permanent memorial to mark the place of his birth, and show that the town was indeed proud of its Drake connection. The Drake family was a area 100 years before Francis was born. In the early 15th century, one Henry Drake leased Crowndale Farm from the Abbey. At that time, the town was centred around Tavistock Abbey, a rich Benedictine institution which also owned considerable property out with the Abbey wall. Despite the upheaval in the English church in Tudor times, the Drake family remained securely as tenants at Crowndale. Francis was the eldest of 12 children, all boys, born to Edmund Drake and his wife. They lived simply in a stone-built cottage with a huge fireplace which dominated the living quarters and provided winter warmth as well as the only means of cooking and heating water. When Francis was born, his grandparents occupied the old farmhouse, while his father and uncle lived in nearby cottages. The family was not wealthy, but by the standards of the day, they were comfortably off. Drake himself told friends that he was born of mediocre parentage. That may be true, but his family certainly had influential connections. When baby Francis was taken to church to be baptized, he had as his godfather Francis Russell, who later became the Earl of Bedford. As was the custom of the time, the baby was given the Christian name of his godfather. Throughout the reigns of the Tudor monarchs, England was in the grip of religious turmoil. The change from Catholicism to the Protestant religion during the reign of Henry VIII was keenly felt in Tavistock, where for centuries the prosperous Abbey of St Mary and St Rumen had controlled the lives of the town's inhabitants. The abbey had been established in 974 by Earl Ordulf, the king's brother-in-law, and was created on a site which had been inhabited since Neolithic times. By the Saxon period, it was already a thriving little community. Over the years, Tavistock Abbey was to become a large and wealthy establishment, and was described by a contemporary writer as the most resplendent west of the magnificent Glastonbury Abbey. Many of the townsfolk, as well as those from the surrounding hamlets, worked for the Abbey in its gardens, fields and craft rooms. Others were kept in business supplying the monks with commodities which they were unable to provide themselves. Life in Tavistock in the days when the abbot and his monks controlled the area was, for the most part, routine and uneventful. Apart from the festivals and feast days, life was a daily round of hard work, both for the monks and for the families whose lives were tied up with the abbey. The monks would rise early, in darkness during the winter, to go to their prayers. After breaking their fast with a simple meal, they'd go about their daily tasks. Some monks ran the small school, which was attended by the sons of the wealthier families. These boys lived in the abbey and shared the life of the novice monks. Tavistock Abbey had its own printing press, and the monks ran one of only 7 presses in constant use in 16th century England. Monks kept the small infirmary at the abbey, which served the local community as well as the religious community, and they also ran the leper hospital. The abbey had its own gardens, and these included the herb gardens where the monks grew and harvested a wide range of plants raised because of their medicinal properties. The still tower, where the religious brothers distilled their potions for treating the sick, survives today as the tower beside the River Tavy in Abbey Walk. From their beehives, the monks collected honey for food, drink and medicines, and from their well-tended orchards, they harvested a selection of autumn fruits. In the fields beyond the abbey walls, cattle were raised, and their milk and meat gave sustenance to the community. It was a working routine which kept the brothers busy from dawn to dusk, and at set hours they would break from their labours to return to the magnificent abbey for prayers and devotion. The holy men also provided lodgings and food for travellers, as well as alms and clothing for the poor and needy. There was a market in the town each Friday, just as there is in present times. At first, stalls were set up around the huge gates in the abbey walls, with Court Gate being the main one. King Henry I granted a royal charter for the monks to run a weekly market in the town centre in 1105. And each year there was a special celebration fair and market lasting 3 days to celebrate the feast of St. Rumen. Even today, Tavistock maintains the tradition of the annual fair and market. These days, it's called Goose Fair, and thousands of people crowd into the town on the second Wednesday of October, when traffic is banned and the streets are filled with market stalls and fairground equipment. Little remains today of the once imposing abbey, which consisted of a large group of stone buildings. Some, according to descriptions, were architectural delights, and they would have dominated the town, as well as being a welcome sight for travellers approaching along the valley of the Tavy. The domination of the Abbey ended in the reign of Henry VIII, and in the following centuries, the magnificent buildings were destroyed. The dissolution of religious houses throughout England came about after a century of increasing unrest and opposition to Catholicism. The fact that England's extravagant king, Henry VIII, saw a way of making a lot of money very quickly also contributed to the sweeping changes which broke up the religious house and saw the dispersal of their properties and lands. Henry became head of the church in England and owner of the riches and land previously owned by the abbeys and monasteries. He made haste to sell them off to replenish his depleted coffers. Tavistock Abbey, with much of its huge estates, was disposed of by the king to John, Lord Russell, and the powerful Russell family went on to acquire more lands and further titles. Eventually, they became the Dukes of Bedford, but to this day, the eldest son of the Duke bears the title Marquis of Tavistock. The Dukes remained owners of Tavistock and land of its inhabitants until early this century, when the properties were sold off to pay death duties. The town centre today owes its appearance entirely to Francis, the seventh Duke, who created this square, the town hall, the pannier market, new streets, and many of the delightful cottages around the town. Francis Drake spent his early childhood at Crowndale. He was a restless and venturesome boy. We can imagine that on Fridays he probably accompanied the adults to Tavistock Market to sell surplus produce from the farm and to buy in provisions. On some visits to the town, they'd doubtless look at the shops, which by Elizabethan times included craft shops which sold wood and tin wares, and shops which sold woolen cloth and simple clothing, and at certain times of the year, premises selling mutton, beef and pork. With its taverns and pie houses and its tinkers and street traders, the town would have been a fascinating place for the little boy. For those who were interested, there'd be tales to hear of adventure and discovery from the many old soldiers and sailors who returned to the town after service in other parts of the country and abroad. And there were always visiting entertainers, such as touring bands of mummers, players and musicians, to engage the interest of a lively young boy. But young Francis Drake was not destined to spend his entire childhood in the comparatively comfortable surroundings of Crowndale and Tavistock. His father, Edmund, was an impetuous man, whose actions and beliefs led to life becoming increasingly difficult for him and his young family in his hometown. Despite his religious convictions, Edmund still managed to get into scrapes. In the spring of 1548, together with a friend, he set upon a man in the village of Peter Tavy and robbed him of his purse. A few days later, he made matters worse by stealing a horse and fleeing in an effort to avoid justice. Doubtless Edmund's father called upon his influential friends to aid his son, for at the end of the year, Edmund was pardoned for both crimes. Incidentally, his father had to borrow heavily from his old landlord and friend John Perrin, former abbot of Tavistock, to pay the legal costs involved in getting Edmund out of trouble. The following year, 1549, saw the Drake family in further trouble. Religious strife flared up in the West Country as Catholics seeking restoration of many of their former religious practices took part in riots, rebellions and marches. A strong contingent of angry Catholics marched from Cornwall to London to make their demands. On the way they gathered supporters, and one group passed through Tavistock, where they damaged the property of known Protestants. Among the families to suffer were the Drakes, whose Crowndale farmhouse was set alight. The strong anti-Protestant feeling at the time, accompanied by an attack on the family home, may have persuaded John Drake to advise his hothead son to leave the area quickly. Whatever the reasons, Edmund and his young family fled the town. They went first to Plymouth Castle, which had held out against the Catholic rebels, and then to the island of St. Nicholas in Plymouth Sound, now called Drake's Island. From there they were taken aboard a ship, probably commanded by their kinsman Richard Drake, to Chatham in Kent. At that time, Francis Drake was aged about 7. From the security of the cottage at Crowndale, the Drake family found themselves on an old hulk on the Medway River, where young Francis was able to observe the ocean-going sailing ships and the men who manned them. Boys left home early in those days, especially if their parents had a brood of younger children to support. At the age of 13, Francis was already working on a small boat, and a couple of years later was taken to sea by his cousin, the celebrated Captain John Hawkins. It was in 1566 that Drake set out on his first expedition to the Spanish Main, and he never forgot his first sight of the West Indies. It was on that voyage that he had his first brush with the Spanish, who outwitted Drake's commander and cost Drake his share of the spoils from the expedition. The following year, Drake, by then captain of the little ship Judith, joined Hawkins on an expedition that was to set the future pattern of England's relationship with Spain. They went to the New World in an attempt to set up a legitimate trade with the Spanish colonies. Their efforts were in vain and ended when the Spanish viceroy in Mexico broke his word of honor and had the English ships attacked while they were at anchor. Hawkins and Drake managed to escape with their ships and as many survivors as they could collect. All the men aboard suffered terrible privations as the ships limped home, sorely overcrowded and almost out of rations. Drake was first home, then Hawkins, and both were commanded to attend the Queen and tell her of the Spanish treachery. The adventurous Drake was back reconnoitring the Spanish Main in 1570, the year following his marriage to Mary Newman. In 1572, he went back again with another expedition, which managed to make away with much of the treasure intended for the King of Spain. The story goes that Drake arrived back in Plymouth on a Sunday when the inhabitants were at church. As news of his arrival and the treasure he carried spread from pew to pew, the church emptied rapidly until only the preacher was left.
He must be dead. Sure he's dead. He's dead. He's not. He's not dead.
It was in November 1577 that Drake set sail on the greatest voyage ever undertaken by an Englishman. He sailed from Plymouth Sound in charge of a small flotilla of ships, although none of the crews knew of the true purpose of the expedition. It was not until the expedition was well underway that Drake revealed the details of their mission, and the crews were filled with dread at the thought of sailing completely round the world. The men were sailing into the unknown. It was true that one of Magellan's ships had circumnavigated the globe 50 years before, but the seas were uncharted, the route was unknown, and the tales and legends surrounding it were terrifying. Magellan, the Portuguese navigator, had died on the original journey, and it's probable that many of Drake's seamen did not fully believe that such a voyage was possible. Yet when the men in the expedition were asked if they wanted to return home, not a man accepted the offer. The omens were not good. Gales beset the ships, and one of Drake's captains stirred up trouble among the men. Off South America, he was executed for mutiny, and Drake changed the name of his ship from Pelican to the Golden Hind. This wooden ship was a mere 90 feet long and 19 feet wide, and it carried a crew of 90 men. Drake had also decided that he needed some creature comforts to make the long voyage more bearable. His ship carried fiddlers to provide music, and he dined off silver plate. 2 ships accompanied Drake on the perilous journey around the tip of South America, but they all lost contact in storms soon afterwards. One was lost. The other returned home the way it had come, and for over a year, Drake and his men were presumed dead. But the Golden Hind sailed on alone across the Pacific Ocean, calling at islands along the route and setting up English trading bases. Drake encountered hostility from some natives and missed a brush with part of the Spanish fleet. After nearly 3 years away, the Golden Hind sailed into Plymouth. At times on the momentous voyage, the ship had been without sight of land for more than a month, a terrifying ordeal for sailors on a voyage of discovery. Drake's first question when he arrived home was, Is the Queen still alive? A prudent inquiry when one considers the changing political and religious climate in England during the rule of the Tudors. On being assured of Her Majesty's good health, he sent word to London of his remarkable voyage. The journey that was the talk of Plymouth soon became the talk of the country, and Drake was ordered to London with his ship and treasure. The capital went wild with delight, and when Elizabeth boarded the Golden Hind at Deptford to knight Drake, she made naval history. For apart from that formal state visit, there's no record of her ever leaving the shore. Drake was well rewarded for his years at sea and for the risks he had taken. His share of the spoils meant that he'd become a man of means. He was feted and treated as a hero wherever he went. What the great man needed was a property to match his new position, and Sir Francis decided it was time to go home. The most settled and carefree years of his life had been spent in Tavistock. His vast family of relations lived in the area, and Plymouth, England's premier port, was nearby. Where better to look than in the area between the two? It was at this time that Sir Richard Grenville decided to sell Buckland Manor, the fine towered country house he'd created from the former Buckland Abbey, which he'd inherited from his grandfather. Sir Richard was a brave and illustrious admiral, but at the time of Drake's circumnavigation he felt himself badly used by his country and particularly by his fellow sailors. Drake bought Buckland Manor through agents, and it was only after the sale that poor Sir Richard discovered he'd sold to his great rival and the country's new favourite, Sir Francis Drake. Buckland cost Drake £3,400. 40 years earlier, King Henry had sold it to the first Sir Richard Grenville for less than £300. Inflation was indeed rampant in those days. Buckland Manor remained in Drake's possession until his death, and stayed in the family until this century. We can imagine the pleasure that owning the manor and its lands would have afforded the new baronet. There he'd be able to entertain his family, naval officers, and influential families in style. The master would spend his days hunting, riding, looking after the estate, visiting, and entertaining. At that time, Drake was described as being fairly short in stature, with a broad chest, a handsome face, and brown hair and beard. Within the manor he established his own household, as befitted a man of means in the Elizabethan period. Most of the staff were men, with only a few women to attend personally on Lady Drake. The kitchen, serving and cleaning staff, and officers of the household were always male in those days. Evenings at the manor would see musicians in the fine wood-panelled chamber entertaining the Drakes and their guests, while they dined in candlelight on dishes prepared and carried from the great kitchen below. Banquets were fashionable in Elizabethan times, and they were made even more popular by the importation of exotic foods from abroad. There were also masques, plays, dancing and board games such as chess and backgammon to help the wealthy families while away the hours. It seems that women played a small part in Drake's life. His first wife died in 1583, and 2 years later he married a local heiress, Elizabeth Sydenham. But there were no children from either marriage, and very soon after that second marriage, Drake was back at sea. In the spring of 1587, Drake left Plymouth on a daring mission of his own devising. The plan, which had full royal backing, was to attack the Spanish fleet in its own harbours. Drake sailed his fleet of 24 ships into Cadiz harbour, boldly defying its fortress guns and armed galleys. Within the harbour they sank or burned 33 ships and managed against the odds to capture 4 more, which were loaded with provisions. The impudent attack, which caused panic among the Spanish on land and sea, delayed the threatened invasion of England. It was an exploit particularly appreciated by Drake's admiring countrymen, and became known as the singeing of the King of Spain's beard. The incident may have delayed the invasion, but the Spanish were proud and determined, and their preparations for war went ahead. It was an unsettling time in England, and her armed forces on land were brought up to strength and drilled. Vice Admiral Sir Francis Drake lived at his Buckland manor when he was able, but was also on call as commander of 3 squadrons of fighting ships at Plymouth. In consequence of England's state of readiness, Buckland Abbey was the scene of many top-level meetings between England's great leaders as counter-invasion plans were prepared. The fleet was at the ready as talk of Spain's mighty and invincible armada grew. News of the Spanish war plans were brought to England by courtiers, merchants, travellers and spies, and the quiet lanes around Buckland must often have echoed to the sound of hoofbeats as messengers carried new intelligence to Drake. Finally, on July the 19th, 1588, alarming news was carried to Plymouth. The Great Armada, or Spanish fleet, had been sighted off the Lizard. According to contemporary documents, Sir Francis Drake was enjoying a game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the news was rushed to him. Legend has it that he declared there was time to finish the game and still defeat the Spanish. But legend doesn't say whether or not he won the game. To the men who had first sighted the mighty armada, it must have been a terrifying sight. A fleet of 130 ships which had set out from Lisbon, sailing line abreast up the channel. 40 massive warships guarded the others, which were mostly merchantmen and small ships. Their role was to pick up the Duke of Parma's army and transfer them from the continent to England. Beacons flared out the danger signal up and down the land, and drums called the militia to arms. But England depended for her safety on her seamen. If the Spanish navy had triumphed, the English soldiers would be no match for the 20,000 experienced men waiting for battle across the sea. The night after the Spanish Armada had been sighted, Drake slipped 2 of his squadrons out of Plymouth. The next day they made preliminary contact with the invasion fleet. A day later the 3rd squadron sailed out, and with their smaller craft the English harassed the Armada. Both fleets sailed up the channel locked in combat. The English ships fired broadsides against the slow-moving Spanish craft and managed to cripple some. But the Spanish guns were stronger, and they held off the English for the most part, although Drake captured the flagship of one of the Spanish commanders. After days of fighting, neither side had gained the advantage. The turning point came 8 days after the 2 sides first made contact, when the Spanish admiral gave orders that his mighty fleet should drop anchor off Calais. They were waters that Drake knew well, and he used that knowledge to devastating effect. Under cover of darkness, 8 old merchant ships were towed towards the enemy and set alight. The tide and the wind carried them towards the close-anchored Spanish fleet. As the blazing ships approached, panic seized the men on the anchored ships. Added to the sailors' deep-rooted fear of fire at sea was ignorance of the treacherous coastal waters and the confusion caused by darkness. Dawn saw chaos among the great fleet. In their anxiety and haste to escape the fireships, many had cut their anchors as they struggled to make good their escape. Several great galleons went aground on sandbanks or collided with each other. The remaining ships in the Spanish fleet, still seaworthy, were without orders and in complete disarray. To add to the plight of the luckless Spanish, a southwesterly gale sprang up which prevented them returning down the channel. So, pursued by the English, they headed northwards. Storms caused more damage and destruction. Some of the ships were driven as far north as Norway. Others were wrecked upon Scottish and Irish shores. Of the 130 proud ships that sailed out of Lisbon, more than half were lost. Only 53 battered vessels returned. It was an amazing victory for the English. Church bells rang out the news of the deliverance, and the country rejoiced. There was feasting and merriment, which masked the relief of the leaders who knew how desperate had been the country's plight. Despite recurring alarms throughout the Queen's reign, the country was secure from further threatened invasion, and Drake was the hero of the hour. The danger over, Drake returned to Buckland. He'd been chosen as Mayor of Plymouth, and he took his civic duties seriously. One of the problems facing the town was getting adequate fresh water supplied to the inhabitants. Drake turned his fertile brain to this matter and adopted a scheme to take water from Dartmoor to Plymouth. This involved the construction of a leat or water channel to carry fresh water 17 miles across country from the River Meavy at Burrator to Plymouth. It was a far-sighted scheme which provided a water supply for Plymouth that lasted until the last century. A contract was drawn up between Sir Francis, who was both Mayor and MP for Plymouth, and Plymouth Corporation in 1589 for taking the waters of the Meavy to the town. The contract shows that Drake was a pretty shrewd businessman. He was allowed to build and operate 6 corn mills along the Leat, a very profitable business in Tudor times. Drake and his band of workmen were paid £200 for excavating the Leat through Burrator Gorge at the end of 1590. The Leat was completed in April 1591, with the work having progressed at the rate of 1 mile a week. Extremely good going for men using basic tools such as picks, shovels, spades, and muscle power. It was not until 1595 that Drake was recalled to service, this time a joint command, and one he was happy to share. Together with his kinsman Sir John Hawkins, he was to sail again to the West Indies. Drake was in his early 50s, but it can be imagined with what pleasure he returned to the sea. The two men must have experienced the same feeling of excitement when they sailed from Plymouth as they'd felt on their first major voyage together some 30 years earlier. But in the intervening years, the Spanish had strengthened their bases, and this time news of their sailing preceded them. They faced a tough task, and to make matters worse, both men became ill off the South American coast. In December, Sir John Hawkins died of fever. Early in the new year, Sir Francis Drake was stricken with dysentery. Confined to his cabin, he was a melancholy man, and was forced to abandon his plan to attack Panama. He was under no illusion about his state of health, and when he felt the end was near, he had his armour taken to him. Arrayed in this, he signed his last will, leaving all his property to his younger brother Thomas, who had shared the peril of many of the earlier voyages. This document can still be seen in Buckland Abbey. He died on January the 28th, and in the time-honoured tradition, the seamen buried their esteemed commander at sea after a simple ceremony aboard the Defiance. The crew returned to Plymouth, bearing the bad news and Drake's personal effects, including his drum, which is still at Buckland Abbey. The imposing statue of Sir Francis Drake in Plymouth Road is Tavistock's permanent memorial to the great seaman. It was erected 100 years ago, after the Victorian inhabitants of the town decided they should do something special to mark the tercentenary of the Armada. The idea was not one that originated in Tavistock, but occurred because of the town's rivalry with a big neighbour on the coast, Plymouth. In 1887, the mayor of Plymouth and half a dozen of that city's worthies visited Tavistock with the aim of raising funds for a statue of Drake to be erected in Plymouth. They got short shrift from Tavistock townsfolk, who were determined not to be eclipsed by Plymouth in the matter of erecting a statue of so worthy a Tavistockian as Sir Francis Drake. Instead, they decided to raise a statue themselves to the famous warrior. Later, quite a few residents experienced some misgivings about the scheme when they realised that a memorial worthy of Drake was going to cost about £2,000, which was quite a considerable sum of money in those days. Then the Duke of Bedford stepped in with the handsome offer of the magnificent bronze statue of Drake by Joseph Boehm. He was a sculptor whose works were much admired by the Victorians, and who was himself knighted by the Queen. The Duke stipulated, at the request of Boehm, that the statue should be sited at the bottom of the newly constructed Plymouth Road, and it was duly placed on its granite plinth there in September 1888. At the base of the statue is this inscription: Sir Francis Drake, one of ye first, who in his voyages put a girdle round the world. Plymouth did get its own Drake statue, by the way. It stands on the Hoe and is in fact a copy of the Boehm statue here in Tavistock. Take my drum to England, hang it by the shore, strike it when your powder's running low. If the Don sight Devon, I'll quit the port of heaven and drum them up the channel as we drummed them long ago.